Hello everybody, this is Cassidy with Undead Furniture Company and the designer behind Undead Hardware. Thank you guys so much for purchasing this tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you guys how to decoupage and blend it out, create 3D moldings, and apply loose leaf gold foil. I hope you guys enjoy. Let's get into it. First thing we're going to do is remove all of the hardware from the entire piece. Some of my furniture pieces I do keep the hardware on and paint over, but for this particular look I will be taking them off. Next thing I'm going to do is clean the entire piece with Dixie Belle's White Lightning. It is a TSP based product, so you will need to rinse it with water afterwards. For this particular project, I did have to take a few of the drawers outside and sand them down just to make them fit a little bit easier. A couple of these were pretty snug against the frame from the piece settling over time. If you do end up needing to sand any of your pieces, just make sure and clean up all the sawdust, otherwise the paint will have a problem adhering to the surface. After I finished up sanding, I did bring all of the drawers back in, assembled the piece, and then primed it with Dixie Belle's Boss in their gray. What the Boss is going to do is stop all of the tannins from bleeding through to make sure that when we lay the paper down later and paint over this, that it's not going to ruin the paint job. It also provides a really nice base color to lay the paper down over. Decoupage does lay better over brighter colors to help the image show up brighter. After the Boss is completely dried, I've taken my decoupage paper out and I'm laying it over to see where the ridges will show up in the paper. This is important to make sure that your hardware holes aren't going to be over part of the image that you don't want covered up, and also to make sure that the ridges aren't going to distort the picture. I like to tear the edges off of my decoupage paper. I feel like when I'm doing projects that the entire photo doesn't go from the very edge of the dresser to the other edge, it helps it to blend a little bit easier when it's a little jagged. Next thing I'm going to do is take my chosen adhesive and paint just a strip along the top there. I do like to set my paper down below it just to measure it out. With these papers, they are pretty thin and they are regular paper, so once they get wet they do start to crinkle. I like to try to line it up before I lay it down. After the paper is positioned where I like, I just lift up the bottom and then paint another strip, and then work section by section, doing maybe about a 2-inch strip at a time. After I've laid the paper back down over that strip, I take more adhesive and I start from the very center and I paint over it downwards and then outwards. This helps to eliminate any bubbles and wrinkles that may happen. As I get to the lip, you can see me pushing downwards to adhere the paper to the top of the lip. I like to ensure that the paper wraps around every edge as closely as it can. That way when you go to cut it afterwards, it's not going to leave any gaps. Most of my time on projects is probably spent laying the decoupage paper just to ensure that all of the ridges and everything are covered the way that I would like. If you do end up cutting them and the underneath shows, then you're going to have to spend even more time trying to paint match all of that through the picture instead of around it, like I'll show you later. There are a lot of decoupage mediums out there to use. I personally like using wallpaper paste. I feel like it is a little bit more slimy and not as tacky, so it does help to move a little bit easier when you're trying to lay that down. A major component to consider when laying decoupage paper, not every paper is the same. There are a lot of papers that are made out of rice, some out of like mulberry fabric type paper, but because this is genuine paper, when it gets oversaturated it can tear, so you'll just have to be careful and not overwork it while it's wet. That also goes for cutting the paper as well. You want to make sure it is completely dry before you try to cut between the drawers, otherwise it will tear it up. You'll see me make a mistake here in a minute where I try to do too big of a section down here at the bottom. I try to finish this off instead of going by my 2-inch rule. So I started with a lip there, and then as I went down and out, you can see how it's trying to create like bubbles and gaps. It is much easier to work with and you do smaller sections at a time. I just grabbed a paper towel here and I'm just wiping off some of the residue. You have to be very careful with this step because the paper is pretty wet, and this is especially when it can start tearing. Next part in the project, we are going to be adding some 3D molds. I am using a Redesign with Prima mold here, designed by CC Restyled. I want to say it's one of her lace molds. I'm just measuring the bottom to make sure that the mold height isn't going to interfere with my hardware. After I've chosen the mold, then we're going to mix up some amazing casting resin and fill the mold. You're going to mix equal parts of A and B. This is the 10-minute set casting resin, and it did take, I want to say, the full measuring cup to fill one of these molds on the bottom there. For those of you who haven't used this, it does start to turn white as it starts to set up. I like to take mine out when they're still a little malleable. It makes it a lot easier to lay them on the furniture piece. And keep in mind, they do get harder and harder the longer they sit, so if you do need to wrap it around something, it is best to get it out when it still is a little malleable. Next thing I'm doing is adding wood glue to the back. I've tried using other glues, and wood glue seems to work the best for these. Then I'm taking a paintbrush and spreading it out to where it's touching every part of the back of this mold. After I have a thin layer of glue applied, I'm going to turn this around and then set it to be lined up with the very bottom of the drawer here. As you push down your mold to your furniture piece, you may notice some of the glue oozing out of the corners. Just take your brush and try to clean that up as best as possible. This glue does tend to dry really hard, and when you try to paint over it, you can see those globs, so just try to go through and remove all of that. Most of the time I do take pieces of tape and tape down my moldings as they're drying, but for this particular piece I didn't. There was quite a bit of surface area underneath it, and because the drawer was laying on its back, I didn't feel like I needed to for this piece. After that's completely dry, I'm going to go in with Dixie Belle's Caviar and their chalk mineral paint. I am dabbing this on. This helps to add a little bit of texture around the edge of that decoupage paper to try to blend that in a little better. As you can see in some of the areas I did actually paint and overlap onto the paper some, I've found that it's a lot easier to try to blend out the entire paper and the background of painting over it than it is to try to color match the background that isn't paper all the way up to the edge of the paper, if that makes sense. So instead of having a halo where you can clearly see the difference between the paper and the furniture piece itself, I'm going to take the black paint up to the edges of the photograph as much as I can without overlapping any of the red feathers. After this first coat has completely dried, I am going to go through with a second coat for solid coverage. Chalk mineral paint does tend to dry pretty quickly, I'd say in about 15 minutes or so it is pretty quick with working time. Next thing I'm going to do is take Palmetto in Dixie Belle's chalk mineral paint and take a lot of water and mist it over the surface and then blot this on. That way it waters down this particular color. As you can see, blending up to those edges that I left, this is a pretty good color match. It's hard to even tell the difference between that little green halo that was the original painted image and then this color that is now overlapping. Having that black painted all the way up into that edge though definitely helps to blend all of this out. Because this particular green hazy type effect can only be created with a dual color combination, that is why I took that black all the way up until the edge and then this blotting over it, so then you can kind of see the color variations. The further down I get on the piece, I am going to use a little less green paint to make it a little more black and have this ombre type effect from a more saturated green at the top down to a more muted green and deeper black down towards the bottom. Now there is a little section right here that I am painting over just to try to blend this out. This particular feather was at the very edge of the paper, and instead of color matching the red to try to recreate the edge of that feather, I blended it to where it looked like it's almost disappearing into the background, just to try to hide it a little bit without needing to go through and try to recreate that with red paint. I did forget to mention too, there was like a little shoulder piece, I believe, off to the left of the face that was the same color of the face. It was like a white cream color. I did end up painting over that with black just because I didn't want to try to color match that and blend it down the rest of the piece as well. As I get towards the very bottom here, I'm only painting up to the edge of the molding and not over it. I do want the molding and below the molding to stay black. Here's a top view of the piece. I do like to do a circular type rusted look on most of my top pieces. As you can see, when you add heat to it and it begins to dry, a lot of the color does fade out, so it blends in quite a bit better. The next part of the project is creating the decoupage book pages down at the bottom. I went through and found a book from the thrift store that has pretty small print. I thought that that would look a little better, and then I'm just tearing out the pages that are most filled with words. Then I'm going to go through and crinkle each one, that way it creates a little bit of texture and makes them look a little older. I'm going to take the same adhesive that I used on the upper part of the decoupage and then apply it first, and then take the pages one by one, push them down, and then layer a heavy layer of glue over top. This is my first project with book pages, and I did find out that they lay a little bit differently, especially when you crinkle them. It doesn't touch as much surface area, so you do have to saturate them quite well to make it stick to the surface. To make them look a little bit more old and rustic as well, I did tear off some of the edges so they were a little jagged. This part of the project, all in all, I want to say took me about 5 hours. Crinkling paper, tearing them up, laying them how I want them. There was a lot of trying to figure out where I wanted to lay stuff, so a lot of it was mapping out as well. As soon as I finished laying the paper down across the entire bottom border in a singular direction, I did start to cut up or tear up pieces of different pages and lay them in a more organic style across the top of the molding and on the sides of the pieces. I did also take some of those little sections and lay them over the bottom border in a different direction to give it a little bit more character. I didn't film this entire step for the project. It did take quite a while, and there was a lot of tearing and piecing things together. I don't think there's any right or wrong way to build up the shape of the pages on the bottom of the piece. I did go with one of my standard looks, and I built up the edges on the left and the right hand side a little more, and then dipped it down a little further towards the center of the piece. After you've got everything laid down exactly where you'd like, I recommend letting this sit for a couple days just to fully dry and cure. Next thing I'm going to do is take Dixie Belle's chocolate and their chalk mineral paint and mist the area that I would like to work with and apply just a little bit of paint at a time to give the paper more of a aged or antique look. I don't want it all one solid color, so I'm just doing this in sections, some a little darker in areas and some lighter in areas. The water really helps to thin out the paint to make it look more of like a stain versus painting over, not being able to see any of the words. Also, the nice part about having done this with glue prior and almost sealing it is if it gets a little too dark in one area, just mist it with water and you can rub some of that color back off of it. One thing I forgot to mention earlier in the video is after the pages had cured with the glue over it, they did change color a little bit. I do want to say that was probably some ink or acid or something within the book pages that caused that to discolor. That does not typically happen with decoupage papers. Like I said, this is my very first time working with book pages, and that's the first time I've ever seen that happen, so I do think it had to do with something within the book itself. Because we crinkled the pages beforehand and then laid them, they did still have some crinkles in them when the glue dried. So if you wanted to dry brush over it afterwards, it would make it darker up on those raised edges. Next part of the project, we are going to be applying gold foil. You do want to use a specific gold foil glue. Regular glue, when it dries, it is no longer sticky. Foil glue, when it dries, it actually tacks up and becomes sticky. That way you can adhere the metal foil to it afterwards. I am going to apply the glue to the entire bottom 3D border that we added earlier. I'm not very adamant on trying to get in every little section. I don't really want the foil to look very uniform either. I'd like it to fit in with the piece. So after you've completely laid it down, you do want to allow it to tack up for the next 15-20 minutes, and then after it is tacky, you can go through and apply all of your foil across the bottom. I'm just using foil from Michaels for this particular project. I do know a couple other brands have foil, but this one seems to work really well and it holds up over time for me. You can be as precise or as messy as you like with this portion of the project. After it's completely set, we're going to take a brush over it and wipe it all back so all of the loose foil will come off. One thing to consider is when you apply the glue, let's say if you were to do a stencil in the future instead of like a raised border, wherever you do apply the glue, it is going to be tacky unless there's something over it. So if you don't lay the foil over it and you do have glue down, you will have some sticky spots on your project. I'm just going back in a couple sections here and adding some foil to these spots that are sticky that I missed. I did also add some areas further up to balance out the piece as well. The last step before adding the hardware is going to be sealing the piece. I do like to use wax primarily when I do decoupage, just because the paper that I use is actual paper. So even though there is a layer of glue over it, when you go through and add a water-based or an oil-based sealer that tends to have a lot of moisture to it, it can reactivate that paper and crinkle it up. So I do like to use wax over particular projects like this. Also, wax is a good choice to use over gold foil. I've found that it leaves a little more of the sheen, whereas some of the water-based sealers, when you apply it over it, can take away some of that shine. And then of course the very last step is just adding whatever hardware you would like to the piece. I was going to apply my own personal brand of hardware to this, but I did run into some issues, so I did end up using the old hardware that came with it. Thank you guys so much for purchasing this tutorial and watching. This is one of my very first tutorials, so I would love any feedback you have to give, and I hope this was informative enough to show you step by step on how to achieve this look. I did recently announce that I am going to be coming out with my own decoupage papers, which I'm really excited about. They will be a rice paper, so they'll work a little differently than this, so stay tuned for any future tutorials and how to use them. Thank you guys so much for watching. Just as a little added bonus, you will receive 15% off on your next hardware purchase if you use the code decoupage at checkout. www.undeadfurnitureco.com